Rome, the greatest empire the world had ever seen. And inside it, three men. One who owned everything, one who owned too much and knew it, one who owned nothing and was himself owned. All arrived at the same conclusion about how a human being should live. That is either the most remarkable coincidence in the history of philosophy, or it is proof that the philosophy is true. Think about what that means. The man sitting on the throne of the world, writing in a military tent by lamplight, and the man chained in a slave quarters, limping on a broken leg, found the same answer. The same answer. What was it? That the only thing you ever truly possess is the quality of your own mind. Everything else, the empire, the wealth, the chains, is on loan. This is the story of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. 3 Romans, 1 philosophy, and the impossible pressure that proved it.
Marcus Aurelius became emperor of Rome in 161 AD, and if you imagine that moment as a triumph, you have it exactly backwards. He was a philosopher by nature, a scholar by preference, a man who had spent years reading Epictetus. We know this because he says so in the Meditations, and who would have been content to keep reading. Power came for him anyway, and then it came for everything he loved. He and his wife Faustina had roughly 13 children. Most of them died. In childhood, in infancy, one after another, across decades. He buried most of his children while simultaneously administering the largest empire on earth. Then, in 165 AD, a pandemic arrived, almost certainly smallpox, and began killing somewhere between 5 and 10 million people across the Roman world. His physician Galen documented it in real time: the pustules, the fever, the mass deaths. Marcus administered relief, kept governing, kept writing. Then his most trusted general, a man named Avidius Cassius, whom Marcus himself had elevated, heard a false rumor that the emperor was dead, and declared himself emperor. Marcus marched to confront him. Cassius was assassinated by his own men before they met. Among Cassius's possessions were letters revealing which senators had supported the coup. Marcus reportedly refused to read them. He did not want to know. He did not want to be forced to punish people he would rather forgive. That is the man. He wrote none of this down as history. He wrote it down as self-instruction, in a private journal never intended for publication, in a military tent on the freezing Danube frontier. Which means when you read the Meditations, you are not reading a philosopher performing wisdom. You are reading a man trying to survive his own life. He wrote to himself, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly." He was the most powerful person alive when he wrote that. He still had to remind himself every morning not to be surprised by human nature, not to be broken by it. He wrote about his dead children and his burning empire and his treacherous general with a line so short it stops you cold. Loss is nothing else but change, and change is nature's delight.
He did not write that because it was easy to believe. He wrote it because it was hard. Because he needed to believe it. The Meditations are not wisdom handed down from a mountaintop. They are a man arguing with himself in the dark, trying to stay sane, trying to stay good, at the top of the world, with the world on fire around him. "Confine yourself to the present," he wrote, again and again, in different forms, across years of campaigns. Not because he had mastered it, because he kept forgetting. And that is the Stoic practice. Not the achievement of peace. The daily, grinding, never-finished work of returning to it.
Now come down from the throne.
Come into the corridors of power, where the deals are made, where the compromises accumulate, where a man who knows exactly what virtue looks like still has to decide every single day how much of it to spend. Seneca was the most celebrated writer in Rome, exiled to Corsica by the Emperor Claudius on a charge that was almost certainly fabricated. Officially, adultery with the emperor's niece, almost certainly a political removal. He went from being one of the most famous men in the Mediterranean world to surviving on a barren island in the middle of nowhere. He kept writing. He kept thinking. When Nero came to power, Seneca was recalled, made tutor to the new emperor, and became, there is no other word for it, one of the most powerful men in Rome. He also became extraordinarily wealthy, fabulously, almost offensively wealthy, for a man who wrote about the vanity of wealth. His critics noticed. They attacked him for it in his own lifetime. And here is what makes Seneca genuinely fascinating rather than simply hypocritical. He attacked himself for it too. He never stopped. He kept writing letters to his friend Lucilius, the collection we call Letters to Lucilius, confessing the gap between what he believed and how he lived. I am not so shameless as to undertake to cure others when I am sick myself, he wrote. A man teaching virtue while admitting he had not achieved it. And then there is the darker fact, the one you cannot look away from. Nero murdered his own mother, Agrippina, in 59 AD, one of the most notorious acts of the ancient world. And Seneca, the Stoic philosopher, the man who wrote about moral courage, almost certainly helped draft the letter to the Senate justifying it. He was in the room. He was complicit. At minimum, he was silent. He kept writing anyway. He wrote some of his most penetrating work in those years, which is either a testament to the compartmentalization of genius or evidence that he was doing exactly what Stoicism requires, continuing to examine himself honestly, even, especially, when the examination was damning. His most important work, On the Shortness of Life, opens like a blow to the chest. It is not that we have a short time to live, but that we waste a great deal of it. Life is long enough, and a sufficiently generous amount has been given to us for the highest achievements, if it were all well invested. He wrote that. A man who had wasted years in exile, who had spent years in the most corrupting environment imaginable, who had looked away when he should have spoken. He wrote about the urgency of time because he had wasted so much of it. The philosophy was not something he had achieved. It was something he was always failing toward. Then, in 65 AD, Nero accused him of involvement in a conspiracy to have the emperor killed. The evidence is disputed. It may have been an excuse. Nero ordered Seneca to commit suicide. Tacitus describes it in extraordinary detail. The veins opened slowly, his aged body bleeding too sluggishly, hemlock administered, finally a steam bath to accelerate death. He reportedly dictated to scribes until near the end. He consoled the friends weeping around him. Let us prepare our minds as if we had come to the very end of life, he had written. Let us postpone nothing. Let us balance life's books each day. He had been writing his own death for 30 years. When it came, he was ready. Or as ready as a man can be. The philosophy he had practiced imperfectly, confessed to imperfectly, lived imperfectly, held him at the end. That is not nothing. That might be everything.
Now come all the way down,
All the way to the bottom. Epictetus was not born with a name. Epictetus is Greek for the acquired one, the enslaved one. We do not know what his mother called him. He was property. He was owned by a man named Epictetus, who was himself a former slave, and who served as secretary to Nero, the same man who ordered Seneca to die. Epictetus lived in the household of the secretary of the man who killed the philosopher he would come to embody. History has a dark sense of symmetry. The story that defines him comes from antiquity. His master, Epaphroditus, twisted his leg as a demonstration of power. Epictetus said calmly, "You will break it." It broke. He then said, "Did I not tell you that you would break it?" He was lame for the rest of his life. Whether that account is literal history or instructive legend, it became the central illustration of everything Epictetus taught. The body is not yours. Your response is. He was eventually freed, likely after Nero's death. He built a school in Rome. Then in 89 AD, Emperor Domitian expelled all philosophers from the city in one of the imperial world's more absurd exercises of power. Epictetus moved to Nicopolis in northwestern Greece and built a more influential school there. He owned almost nothing. A straw mat, a pallet, a clay lamp. He considered this sufficient. He wrote nothing himself. Everything we have, the discourses and the Enchiridion, or handbook, was written down by his student Arrian, who loved what he heard enough to transcribe it. The man who would become a foundational influence on Marcus Aurelius, who shaped Roman Stoicism for centuries, left not a single word in his own hand. A former slave's ideas survived entirely because a student cared enough to write them down. And the ideas are ferocious in their simplicity. Men are disturbed not by the things which happen, but by the opinions about the things. For example, death is nothing terrible, for if it were, it would have seemed so to Socrates. For the opinion about death, that it is terrible, is the terrible thing.
Read that slowly. He is not saying suffering is an illusion. He is saying that the story you tell about your suffering is where the real damage is done. The broken leg hurts. The belief that a broken leg has diminished you, that is the injury that cripples. This from a man who had every reason to believe the world had diminished him, who had been property, who had been broken, literally broken, to prove a point about power. And he looked at all of that, the chains, the fracture, the erasure of his name, and concluded that none of it had touched the essential thing. None of it had gotten inside. Make the best use of what is in your power, and take the rest as it happens. That is the whole philosophy. That is the Enchiridion in one line. Everything inside, yours. Everything outside, not yours. Work on yours. Release the rest. Simple. Brutally, impossibly, daily practice simple. He also said something that lands differently when you know who is saying it. When you know this man had no rights, no legal standing, no name of his own choosing. If anyone tells you that a certain person speaks ill of you, do not make excuses about what is said of you, but answer, "He was ignorant of my other faults, else he would not have mentioned only these." That is not detachment. That is a kind of invincibility. 3 men. The emperor, the statesman, the slave. One at the top of Roman society, one in its corridors of power and compromise, one at its absolute bottom, owning nothing, not even his own name. Marcus Aurelius had every external thing, and could not stop losing the internal battle. Could not stop needing to remind himself every morning to stay present, to stay kind, to stay good. Seneca had power and wealth and brilliant prose and a conscience that never let him rest, that kept forcing him to confess the gap between what he wrote and how he lived, right up until the moment he bled out on Nero's orders. Epictetus had nothing, had been given nothing, had had things taken from him that should never be taken from a person, and sat in Nicopolis teaching students that they were free. The same philosophy, the same conclusion, reached from opposite ends of everything. What does that mean? It means Stoicism is not a philosophy for the comfortable. It is not a productivity framework or a mood. It is a practice for people under impossible pressure. and the pressure is always impossible, and the practice is never finished. Marcus knew this. Seneca knew this, painfully, publicly, at the cost of his integrity and finally, his life. Epictetus knew this before he knew anything else, because the world taught it to him before he could speak. The obstacle becomes the path. The exile becomes the education. The broken leg becomes the proof. What is in your power? Just that. Just the quality of your attention, the character of your response, the integrity of your inner life. Everything else is weather. 3 Romans. An emperor who wrote philosophy by lamplight in a war tent. A millionaire who confessed his failures in letters to a friend. A slave who taught freedom from a straw mat. One philosophy. And it worked. It held them. Not perfectly, Seneca least of all, Marcus more than he knew, Epictetus in a way that should not have been humanly possible. But it held. At the very edge of what human beings can endure, it held. That is worth understanding. That is worth practicing. That is worth returning to every single morning, the way Marcus did, the way he had to, the way we all have to. Because the work is never done, and the present is always here, and the only thing you ever truly own is what you do with it. Thank you for listening to the story of Marcus Aurelius, Seneca, and Epictetus. If you'd like more stories like this, make sure to subscribe and leave a comment on who you'd like to hear about next.